Good evening. In the last in the last video, I discussed the background of um, the Denton Protocol and exactly the situation and the nature of diplomatic communication and diplomatic courtesy in micronationalism. And I promised this video um, to discuss the Denton Protocol versus the Levaria Treaty. Before we begin, the initial background of the Denton Protocol was uh, knowing, or for me, learning that micronationalists had refused to address the new prime minister for Zealandia by gender neutral pronouns. Um, simply um, simply saying that, I'm sure it will spark enough controversy, but it was in my hope that Sandis, Zealandia, and other micronations could sign a protocol whereby we recognize the gender identity of all micronationalists. We consider it to be on par with diplomatic courtesy that any other diplomat or head of state should receive. Um, and so that is actually what is said in the preamble of the protocol. Whereas the signatories consider it a priority to provide decent respect for micronational diplomats, national leaders, and government officials who fall within trans and LGBTQ plus identities and communities. Whereas the signatories consider the respect to trans and LGBTQ plus officials a matter of state and national importance for the signatories, whereas the signatories themselves are members of the LGBTQ plus and allied communities and identify as LGBTQ plus. That should be an or actually. Whereas trans identities are defined as transgender, transsexual, female to male, male to female, gender non-binary identities, gender questioning, and gender uh, identities and expressions falling outside the traditional and heterosexist paradigm of gender and sexuality. Therefore, the signatories ascribe to this protocol to protect the necessary diplomatic respect between diplomats and official representatives and chargés d'affaires, uh, uh, chargés d'affaires of governments who identify as trans or LGBT. Um, so the preamble there specifically calls out that this is what the protocol is meant to do. In the Levaria Treaty, however, it's much more simpler. In fact, on the Wikipedia article, I'm actually reading it on my phone. The treaty says that it was created after the creation of the Denton Protocol and came after the Denton Protocol came under scrutiny, and that it still wanted to provide some rights to LGBT, well, here they say LGTB rights, um, and that it's sort of a moderate position meant to appease right-wing micronations. The difference is in what is essentially in the background, whereas the Denton Protocol is taking a specific event and seeking to rectify it. The treaty, on the other hand, sees the protocol as being too radical and waters it down. And the point of this video is that I'm trying to say that in watering it down, you first of all make a document such as the Levaria Treaty that should be performed by internal laws and not by international laws. And it doesn't even address the original situation of of the diplomatic disrespect for micronationalists who are trans. It would have been a much more effective treaty if it had been the Denton Protocol and just simply removed Article 3 that says the protocol authorizes people to renege on agreements of pseudonyms, styles, and addresses if they don't respect trans people. Article 1 of the Denton Protocol says, signatories shall respect the preferred names and styles and addresses and styles of address of government officials of all recognized states insofar as the limits expressed in Article 3. Article 2, signatories shall respect the gender identity, gender expression, and preferred pronouns of LGBTQ plus people whose identities and pronouns are recognized by LGBTQ plus studies and discourses on gender and sexuality. That's an appeal to a broader body than just listing the different identities. Article 3, in case any party should not respect the preferred names, gender pronouns, and other communicated elements of LGBTQ plus identities and peoples, a signatory to this protocol may refuse to recognize the preferred name, style, dress, or pronoun of the violating official in a way synonymous with the violation of respect dealt by the other party, as envisioned within this protocol. In other words, should any non-signatory to this protocol refuse to respect the gender identity of another official whose government is a signatory to this protocol, the signatory government may refuse to use and communicate preferred names, styles of addresses, and titles of the violating official, essentially wiping them all clean. Article 4, the signatories envision a process of notifying the other signatories of violations of this protocol by non-signatories and signatories alike, so that all signatories may operate as bloc in the international community as proponents and defenders of LGBTQ plus peoples. This protocol envisions a diplomatic and international community where gender identity is respected and treated carefully in the same way that styles of address, titles, and pseudonyms are treated in the broader and micronational world. Essentially, that Article 5 goes back to the same topic that I was discussing in the last video. And Article 6, this protocol shall henceforth be named the Denton Protocol after the canton in Zealandia. This protocol shall come into effect in each signatory immediately following the signing of each representative government. The Levaria Treaty, however, is much more watered down. Consider that the Denton Protocol saw a specific event, responded to it, by saying, essentially, if other micronationalists do not respect the transgender identities of other micronationalists, then signatories can operate as a bloc to remove styles of address, for instance, Their Excellency, His Excellency, Her Excellency, or even their titles. You could stop addressing them as Duke. You could just say Mr. So-and-so. And pseudonyms. If you know their actual name, you can use it. That is essentially what the diplomatic protocol says. But many people who are signatory to the Denton Protocol have decided not to do that because it's simply better to sign a document that says that you want to respect the trans identities of people and just not enforce Article 4. That's the good thing about the protocol, is that it's not enforceable. It's sort of like the Intermicronational Treaty of Peace, if I believe that's what it's called. But there was a treaty from 2009 or 2010 that people would sign so that they would be against war. And actually that one was fostered by Niels of Vengeances. The Levaria Treaty, however, is much different. Signatories will view LGBTQ people as equal citizens. They will hold the same rights as the majority groups. In this affair, in the specific first article, but in the specific first article, this should be dealt with on, really, this should be considered to be equality before the law. That's a fundamental basis of all legal and judicial proceedings, is that all people are equal before the law. So that should be dealt with on the internal side, especially if one's nation doesn't have equality before the law. Article 2, signatories will respect the identities of their citizens and will use the pronoun desired by the individual, along with foreign diplomats, leaders, and representatives. That's good. And that is a good article to agree upon for the treaty. Article 3. Signatories view the LGBT movement as a necessary act to gain equality. However, they are free to criticize the movement should they feel it does not act to attain its goals in acceptable ways. That article specifically is the purpose of LGBT studies and discourses. And if one has an issue with that, then that is the reason why LGBT studies exists, to criticize the movement, or for other people to write political things about the movement, stating specifically what is wrong with the movement. So fundamentally, that is an entire beast than it is already, because that is a more discursive way to address the situation. And really, anyone is entitled to that if they believe, if a micronation has the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of press, and freedom of speech, then anyone has that right. Article 4. Signatories will recognize the right for other micronations to disagree with the beliefs stated in the treaty. Signatories will be urged to remain civil towards others despite conflicting beliefs, and will not act against a micronation due to a difference of beliefs. This is the article that I have the most issues with, primarily because it doesn't address the situation, the event that led to the creation of the Denton Protocol. Micronations can disagree, and they are it is their sovereign right to disagree and to have laws contrary to what I would say is trans acceptance or trans inclusivity. But when discussing in a diplomatic way, if one state should refuse to address another state through that state's acceptable diplomatic styles and addresses, again, this goes back to the other video that I made earlier, then they are infringing upon the sovereign right of that state to have those styles of addresses. Essentially, in doing so, if another state, it's complicated, if another state should refuse to address a micronationalist in a way congruent with that other state, what they're essentially doing is infringing upon the right of other micronationalists to disagree. They're infringing upon the right of a diplomat of a micronationalist to act and to be addressed and identified in a way congruent with how they are viewed in their nation. This goes back to the difference. This goes back to the synergy, as I mentioned in the other video, where some national customs should be given up, but some can't be. And really, that's why the synergy there you have to be discursive about that, and say, well, I'll stop addressing you as monsieur, but you have to address me as she, even though my biological sex is he. In languages, we don't address things by sex. We address them by gender. It is a misconception to say that we address them by sex, because we can address, for instance, cat in French is le chat. It's always masculine, even if le chat is feminine. If the cat has female body parts. It's the same for inanimate objects. I know in Native American languages, there's actually, I can't recall correctly if there's a difference between, no, in the language I'm thinking of Abenaki. There's no difference between gender, but there is a difference between animate and inanimate objects. And so, in many languages, including the languages that they speak of, there are typically three genders: masculine, feminine, and neutral. But even inanimate objects are gendered in a specific way. For instance, a pen in French is le stylo. It's masculine, if I recall correctly. Or it could be la plume, and that's feminine. And that's the issue with addressing items by gender, because this doesn't have a sex. This has a gender, a socially constructed identity that goes masculine to feminine. To say that we address people by their sex is also not true, because certainly for trans people, if there is that idea that they can pass, then you don't know what their sex is. Truly, no one knows what anyone's sex is, unless if it's said to them. I could say I'm a man, it doesn't mean that I have a penis. You don't know that. And you will likely never know that. Especially because I will never show you. And then you will never know. And that's the big thing, is that as micronationalists, we must recognize that people identify in different ways. If, for instance, and this is also a topic of linguistics that, unfortunately, I don't have the information on. I know many other micronationalists do, who can say, well, really, in these languages, there are these many genders, and this is how they conceive of them. The ultimate root is that gender and sex are not the same thing. In language, we apply gender to different things. I was actually having a conversation last night with someone outside of micronationalism about whether or not, in ancient Greek, the term boyish, as in a boyish guy or a boyish man, was, if it had the same gender connotation that we do in English. For instance, a lot of mythological characters like Apollo or Hyacinth, or, for instance, Antonius, the beloved of the Emperor Hadrian, they're often called boyish for some reason in a lot of modern descriptions of them. But why is that? I know because in English, at least from where I'm from, boyish can mean a sort of feminine, effeminate. A boyish man is someone who's effeminate. And so is there that same gendered connotation in ancient Greek? And my friend said, no, not really. It's mostly just about puberty. And that was very eye-opening, because where do we in English then get that gendered connotation, to call someone boyish, um, and to conceive of them as being effeminate. Um, I certainly don't know. And see, that's the issue of language, because I'm sure for many micronationalists, the concept of gender just isn't there for them. Because just like the ancient Greeks, they probably didn't consider um, uh, this socialized concept of gender. They probably had different ways that they thought about it. For instance, in this case of ancient Greek, puberty. Um, so this is all, or in Abenaki, as I was thinking earlier, the difference between animate and inanimate. um, and then there is no gender in discussing something one doesn't know. So I went off on a tangent. I apologize. The thing here is that signatories will remain civil towards others despite conflicting beliefs. That should go both ways. Ultimately, if a micronationalist does not agree that trans identities exist, then by all means they can speak to the other person. And I didn't actually say this to him, but for instance, Bradley of Doulahan, Bradley Vanderhoven, said that he was addressing the topic with Queen Astrid of Zealandia. And if those two want to make their own agreement where Bradley Doulahan doesn't have to call Queen Astrid of Zealandia a queen, if they can just say monarch or reigning person, then, and not do that. And if Queen Astrid is fine with that, then certainly I believe that should be an acceptable compromise. But overall, it's going back to the same topic that I discussed before, that there is not a linear thought here, that Sandus must give up local custom in addressing people as monsieur, but that these people shouldn't have to give up local custom and national custom in not addressing trans people by their correct and preferred gender, by their gender identity. So the issue here is ultimately that truly that we all need to remain civil, and that ultimately we need to come to this synergy. We need to have these discussions and not call each other, crazy or stupid, or Madame Marsupial, or even in my case, to be fair, to not address people not by their pseudonyms. But we need to discuss why this conversation is important. Because there are transgender micronationalists in our community, and we have to come to a point where they feel comfortable being recognized and respected, because ultimately this is what diplomacy is about. It's about about acting on behalf of a state for whatever goals. And if people don't want to recognize trans identities, that's their right. But then you should allow us to respond, because ultimately that is within our freedom of speech to do so as well. So I hope that actually I can speak with Messieurs Mar and Abdullahan in the next few days, hopefully I can speak to Mr. Kennedy, who falls outside of this paradigm of the Monsieur Agreement. I don't know how to analyze that situation, but ultimately it's the same thing. That there is diplomatic courtesy involved here that should be neutral, ultimately. So, hopefully, people will have conversations with me, and I hope so, because but neither the protocol or the treaty are preferential. Truly, we should hope that we wouldn't need either. But we do, unfortunately. We need to garner respect for people in the community, for transgender nationalists. And ultimately, we need to work towards making this a more amiable community for all people, regardless of their gender identity.